Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Mountain Man's Warning. It was late fall when Jack and his group of 4 friends set out for a week-long camping trip in the remote part of the Rocky Mountains. They had planned the hike for months, eager to escape the grind of city life and spend some time in the peaceful wilderness. The area was known for its stunning views, untouched forests, and solitude. It was the perfect getaway. They reached their campsite late in the afternoon, setting up tents near a clear, chilly stream surrounded by towering pines. The evening air was crisp, and the shadows from the mountains stretched across the valley, making the landscape look like something out of a painting. After a long day of hiking, they built a campfire, sat around it, and exchanged stories. Around dusk, just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, an old man appeared at the edge of their campsite. He was grizzled, his beard long and unkempt, his clothes weathered from years of exposure to the elements. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the group before finally resting on them. "Not a good place to camp," the man rasped, his voice rough as if he hadn't spoken in years. Jack, the leader of the group, stood up and smiled. "We'll be fine. We got all the gear we need. Who are you anyway?" The old man didn't respond to the question, instead casting a long look toward the dense woods behind him. His eyes seemed to pierce through the trees as if he could see something none of them could. "There's something out there," he muttered. "Something that roams these woods when night falls. It's not just animals. You don't know what's out there. Trust me, you don't." His voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if he was afraid someone, or something, might hear. "Stay out of the woods after dark. Keep your fire going. And whatever you do, don't go near the old cabin up the trail." The group exchanged puzzled glances, half laughing at the old man's warning. They had heard stories from locals about wild animals, maybe a cougar or a bear roaming the area, but nothing that seemed dangerous enough to be worth avoiding. They figured he was just some eccentric old hermit who had seen too many horror movies. Jack gave the man a sympathetic nod. "Thanks for the tip, old-timer," Jack said, his voice lighthearted. "But we'll be fine." The man didn't seem reassured. He took a long look at each of them, as if sizing them up, before turning and vanishing into the woods. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, and soon he was swallowed by the darkness between the trees. As night settled in, the fire crackled, and the group settled around it, telling stories and laughing. The wind picked up slightly, but the night was calm. The distant mountains loomed like silent sentinels, and everything seemed peaceful. Still, something about the old man's words stuck with them. Later that evening, as they all turned in for the night, the sounds of the forest filled the air. The wind rustled the branches, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. But then, around midnight, something else began to stir in the trees. At first, it was just a faint noise, a crackling of branches. Maybe it was a bear, or some other large animal moving through the woods. But then it grew louder. It sounded like something big was moving, something heavy, and it wasn't just passing by. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling their campsite. The noises came in waves, crunching leaves, the snap of twigs, the low groan of shifting weight. Jack's heart began to race. He sat up in his tent, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The others were awake now, too, their voices hushed as they whispered about what could be out there. They knew about the bears, but this was something different, something more deliberate. The noises continued throughout the night. It felt like something was watching them. The wind died down, and the usual forest sounds disappeared. All they could hear was the slow, rhythmic movement outside the tents. The large, muffled footfall seemed to grow closer, and then farther away, as though whatever it was pacing back and forth, just beyond the reach of their firelight. By dawn, the noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The group was exhausted, their nerves shot from the tension of the night. They gathered around the campfire, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it a bear, a moose, or something else entirely? As they stood up to break camp, something caught Jack's eye. He walked over to the trees near their site and froze. On the bark of the nearest tree were massive, jagged claw marks, deep enough to gouge through the wood. They were far too large to have been made by any ordinary animal. The marks were fresh, the edges still raw, as if whatever made them had been very recently here. "What the hell is this?" Jack whispered, his voice shaking. The others gathered around, their faces pale as they looked at the marks. They had been so focused on the sounds that they hadn't thought to check for tracks, but now that they looked, they could see the broken branches and deep scratches on the ground. Evidence of something large, something powerful that had moved through the area. That's when it hit them. The old man's warning wasn't just some wild tale. There was something dangerous in these woods, something they had underestimated. With heavy hearts and a deep sense of unease, the group packed up their camp. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched as they dismantled their tents and loaded their gear. The towering trees seemed to close in around them as they made their way to the trail. They left the campsite quickly, not daring to look back. As they descended down the mountain, they passed the trail that led toward the abandoned cabin the old man had mentioned. They glanced toward it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting in the shadows. They picked up the pace, eager to leave the forest behind. When they reached the nearest town, they told the locals about their strange experience. The locals didn't seem surprised. One of them, an elderly woman, told them the story of a creature that roamed the woods, a creature that was said to have lived in the mountains for centuries. Some said it was a bear, others said it was something much darker, something that no one should ever encounter. None of the group ever spoke about that night again. They returned home, but the memory of the sounds in the woods, the claw marks on the trees, and the old man's warning stayed with them. They knew one thing for certain. There was something in those mountains, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed, and they would never venture back into those woods again. Story 2. The eyeless figure. It had been a long, scorching day for Ethan. The Utah desert was beautiful in its own way, vast and empty, but it had a certain loneliness that crept into the soul if you spent too long in its grip. Ethan had chosen the spot for his solo camping trip carefully, remote, isolated, and perfect for a peaceful night under the stars. He had been planning this getaway for months, needing some time away from the constant noise of the city, wanting to reconnect with nature and himself. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in rich hues of orange and purple when Ethan set up his camp. The silence around him was almost deafening, the only sound the wind whispering through the dry brush. After a simple meal of freeze-dried food and a cup of warm coffee, Ethan crawled into his tent, wrapped in a blanket, and tried to settle into the stillness. He had brought a book with him, but the silence of the desert made it hard to concentrate. Soon, he turned off his headlamp, closed his eyes, and let the desert night take over. It was sometime in the middle of the night when he woke up. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a noise, or maybe just the feeling of being watched. His eyes opened slowly, and the darkness inside the tent seemed thicker than before. For a moment, he thought he heard something faint outside. Footsteps, soft and slow, crunching across the sand. He told himself it was just an animal, perhaps a coyote or a stray dog. But the footsteps didn't stop. They lingered, as if whatever it was standing still, just outside his tent. Ethan froze. He hadn't expected any visitors in this remote spot, and the idea of someone, or something, approaching his campsite made his heart race. He didn't move, didn't breathe. His eyes darted around the interior of the tent, searching for anything that could explain the sound. But it wasn't the footsteps that had his full attention now. It was the figure he could make out just beyond the fabric of his tent. A tall, thin shape stood in the shadowed desert night, silhouetted against the faint glow of the stars. At first, Ethan thought it might be a person, some unfortunate hiker who had gotten lost. But there was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. The figure didn't move, not even an inch. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes locked on it. He couldn't look away, couldn't bring himself to move or speak. The shape was human in form, but disturbingly unnatural. It was tall, too tall, and thin impossibly so. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its body thin and skeletal. But what truly terrified him was its face, or rather, the absence of it. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness. Deep, hollow pits where eyes should have been, empty sockets that seemed to stare right through the fabric of his tent, through him and into his soul. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, motionless, its empty gaze locked onto him. Ethan felt a wave of terror grip him, a primal fear that froze him to the core. The figure's presence was like a weight pressing on his chest, suffocating him. He couldn't tell if it was real or if he was hallucinating, his mind playing tricks on him in the desert night. Time stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. Ethan didn't dare make a sound, his body paralyzed with fear. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to get away. But his body refused to obey, and all he could do was stare back at the figure, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the figure moved. It didn't turn away or walk. It simply shifted, its thin limbs gliding through the air as though it were weightless. The figure took a few slow steps backward, moving away from the tent, and then turned and vanished into the darkness of the desert. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he strained his ears, hoping to hear footsteps retreating into the night. But there was nothing. The silence returned, as though the figure had never been there at all. When he could finally move again, Ethan sat up in his tent, gasping for breath, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring into the darkness, listening for any signs of movement. But the desert remained still, unnervingly so. He thought about calling out, but no sound left his lips. He was alone, completely alone. The rest of the night was a blur of sleeplessness. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that the desert itself had turned against him. When the first light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, he didn't wait any longer. He grabbed his gear and left the tent, eager to put distance between himself and whatever he had seen. The desert was eerily quiet as he packed up his camp. The wind had died down, and the air felt heavy with a strange tension. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the eyeless figure to appear again, but there was nothing, just the barren landscape stretching out in every direction. As Ethan moved around his campsite, he noticed something strange in the sand. Deep, claw-like prints, as if something had been dragging its limbs across the desert floor. The marks were large and distinct, leading away from the spot where the figure had been standing, but they didn't seem to follow any logical path. They just stopped at a certain point, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Ethan's stomach churned. He could hardly bring himself to look at the prints, but something inside him told him to keep moving, to get out of there before whatever had haunted him that night returned. He hurriedly packed the last of his gear and left the campsite, his footsteps quick and urgent in the sand. As he walked away, the feeling of being watched never left him, the memory of the eyeless figure lingering in his mind, a reminder of the strange, dark forces that sometimes lurk just beyond the reach of our understanding. Ethan never returned to that part of the desert. He couldn't shake the feeling that something not entirely human, had been waiting for him that night. And perhaps it was still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the desolation. Story 3. The Hiker Who Never Returned. It was supposed to be just another summer trip for the seasoned hikers, a journey into the heart of Yosemite National Park. The group had hiked together for years, with some of them veterans of the rugged trails and others still learning the ropes. But this time was different. The hike would take them deep into the backcountry, far from the marked trails and civilization. They had set out early, eager to make the most of the day. The plan was simple. Hike a few miles into the wilderness, set up camp, and spend the night beneath the stars. Everyone was excited. The air was fresh, and the dense trees whispered above them as they moved along the trail. They laughed and talked, sharing stories and jokes as they hiked deeper into the heart of Yosemite. One of them, Ben, was an experienced hiker. He had been hiking these trails for over a decade, and his expertise was respected by the group. He'd taken part in several more challenging expeditions, including backcountry camping and high-altitude climbs. Ben had a reputation for moving fast and efficiently through the wilderness, and today he volunteered to scout ahead, looking for a possible route to the next camp. "Don't worry about me. I'll catch up," he told the group as he waved them off. He had a map, a compass, and more than enough gear to handle whatever lay ahead. The group agreed, trusting Ben's judgment and abilities. They continued their hike, knowing he would be back soon enough. Hours passed. By midday, the group stopped for a rest, sitting down by a small creek that ran through the woods. They hadn't seen Ben since he had gone ahead, but they didn't think much of it. He was a seasoned hiker, after all, and he'd probably found a better trail, or was taking a detour to scout for the night's campsite. But as the hours stretched on, unease began to creep in. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and still there was no sign of Ben. The group exchanged worried glances, but they shrugged it off, telling themselves that he was fine. Probably just lost track of time, or maybe he was scouting a better path that would make the next leg of their hike easier. It wasn't until evening that the first real signs of concern emerged. The group began calling for Ben, shouting his name into the vast wilderness. There was no response. The sounds of the forest, chirping birds, the rustle of leaves, seemed to grow louder in the eerie silence that followed. They waited, hoping to hear a familiar voice, or at least the sound of footsteps crunching on the trail, but the stillness was oppressive. They decided to backtrack. They retraced their steps, calling out once again for Ben, but the forest remained quiet. The trees towered above them, casting long shadows in the fading light. They searched the surrounding area, stopping every few minutes to listen for any sign of him. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, not even a trail of footprints. It was as though Ben had simply vanished into thin air. As the light began to fade and darkness crept over the forest, they decided to stop for the night. But the unease continued to gnaw at them. They huddled around the campfire, trying to stay warm as they made plans to search again at first light. The next morning, they resumed their search, now feeling the weight of urgency. They split into smaller groups, combing every inch of the trail and surrounding area. The forest was dense, and the terrain was rough, rocky cliffs, deep ravines, thick underbrush. But still, there was no sign of Ben. Then, just as they were about to give up hope, one of them noticed something strange. A torn piece of Ben's backpack, hanging from a tree branch. The fabric was ripped, as though it had been caught on something sharp or jagged. The group approached cautiously, and as they examined the area more closely, they saw no other sign of Ben. No tracks, no gear, nothing that could explain how his belongings had ended up here. The piece of fabric was the only trace of him, suspended in the air as if it had been placed deliberately. The group stood in stunned silence, staring at the torn fabric. It didn't make sense. Ben was an experienced hiker. He knew how to navigate the wilderness. There was no way he would have simply lost his backpack, and even if he had, it didn't explain why he hadn't returned. The search continued for days, with the group expanding their efforts, but Ben was never found. No trace of him remained beyond that small piece of torn fabric. The local authorities were alerted, and a formal search and rescue operation was launched. They combed the wilderness for miles, checking caves, ravines, and other possible hiding places, but there was nothing. The official explanation was that Ben had become disoriented, possibly lost his bearings, and was unable to find his way back to the trail. But that didn't explain the missing backpack, or why there were no signs of struggle, or any other clues that might have led them to him. Some speculated that he had encountered a dangerous animal or an accident, but no evidence of either was ever found. Others whispered about something more sinister, something that lurked in the wilderness, waiting to claim those who wandered too far. The group couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the wilderness had taken Ben in a way they couldn't explain. They continued their hike, but the joy of the trip had evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The haunting memory of their missing friend remained with them long after they left the park, and to this day, none of them can forget the sight of that torn piece of fabric hanging from the tree. Ben was never found. Story 4. The flashlight that didn't work. It was a crisp autumn evening in the Appalachian Mountains when a group of friends set up camp at a secluded site, miles from the nearest trailhead. The air smelled of pine, and the forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife, though there was an eerie calm that seemed to hang over the area. They'd been hiking all day, and the campsite, nestled in a small clearing near a trickling stream, seemed perfect for a peaceful night under the stars. There were 5 of them: Alex, the adventurous leader of the group; Sarah, the skeptic who always had a logical explanation for everything; Tim, the quiet one who preferred solitude; Rachel, the nature enthusiast; and Mike, the prankster who had a reputation for playing jokes on everyone. The evening passed like any other camping trip. They gathered firewood, shared stories around the campfire, and roasted marshmallows. As the fire died down, the group retreated to their tents for a much-needed rest. The forest was quiet now, the chirps of the crickets and the rustling of leaves the only sounds that kept the night from being completely silent. But around 2 a.m., Alex was jolted awake by a loud crack of a twig, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest. At first, he thought it might be a bear, but the sound was too controlled, too deliberate. It was as if something was walking through the woods with purpose. He turned to Sarah, who was sleeping beside him, and shook her awake. "Did you hear that?" he whispered urgently. She nodded, her face pale as she sat up, scanning the darkened tent. "Could be a bear. Could be a person," she said, her voice low. "But it doesn't sound like either. We should check it out." They both quietly grabbed their flashlights, the dim light of the fire now just a faint glow in the distance. Sarah flicked hers on first. The beam lit up the surrounding trees, but flickered faintly, as if the batteries were already dying. She shook it, but the beam didn't stabilize. "Great," Alex muttered under his breath, reaching for his own flashlight. He turned it on, but the beam also sputtered. He banged it a few times against his palm, hoping it would work properly. Then they heard it again, closer this time, the crack of a branch, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving. Alex's flashlight blinked erratically and then seemed to settle, casting a cold, narrow beam of light into the woods. For a moment, the beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. But then, just on the edge of the clearing, something caught their eye. There, standing motionless, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally still, blending in with the trees behind it. At first, Alex thought it might be one of their friends trying to prank them, but something felt off. The figure didn't move, nor did it make a sound. It stood there, frozen, its shape indistinct in the darkness. The beam flickered again, momentarily casting its light onto the figure's face. For a split second, Alex could have sworn he saw eyes, two hollow, dark pits where eyes should have been. His breath hitched in his throat. The flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, the figure had vanished, leaving nothing but the soft rustling of leaves behind. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she held her flashlight with shaking hands. Alex didn't respond immediately. He was too stunned to speak. He had no explanation for what he had just seen. He looked back toward the woods, but there was nothing there. "No," he finally whispered. "I didn't see anything," but the fear in his voice was evident, and Sarah knew he had seen the same thing. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds of the forest, now seeming louder and more oppressive. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, and distant animal calls echoed in the distance. But that figure remained fresh in their minds. The hollow eyes, the stillness, the feeling that something was watching them. "We need to wake up the others," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, but as he turned to head toward the tent, another noise interrupted him. This time, closer. They both froze. The sound of something large moving through the woods, unmistakable. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had returned. Alex quickly shone the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam flickered again, and when it settled, the figure was gone once more. No footprints, no signs of movement. They returned to the tent, their hearts racing, and woke Tim, Rachel, and Mike. They quickly explained what had happened, but none of them could offer a logical explanation. Tim was skeptical, saying it was probably just a bear or some other animal, while Rachel thought it might have been a person wandering off the trail. Mike, ever the prankster, just laughed and said they were all imagining things. But no one slept that night. The silence outside their tents felt suffocating, and every creak of the trees or rustle of the leaves set their nerves on edge. Every so often, they would hear a snap of a twig or the sound of something moving just beyond the light of the campfire. As dawn broke, they emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and exhausted, but relieved to see the morning light filtering through the trees. They packed up their camp in silence, each person feeling the weight of the previous night's events. The woods felt different in the light of day, somehow less menacing, but still unsettling. When they finally hiked out of the clearing, none of them spoke much about the figure they had seen. They couldn't explain what had happened. Was it a figment of their imagination? A trick of the light? Or had they truly seen something that wasn't supposed to be there? One thing was certain, whatever it was, it had watched them all night. And for the rest of the hike back, none of them could shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the woods, just beyond the trees, waiting for the night to fall again. Story 5. The Lone Campsite. Lena and Jake had been planning their road trip for months. They were both nature lovers, always seeking the quiet and peace that only the wilderness could offer. After a few days of driving up the Pacific Northwest coast, they found themselves in a small, secluded forest, far from the well-worn trails that other campers often visited. The area was breathtaking, tall pines, the smell of wet earth, and a stream trickling nearby. It felt like the perfect spot to pitch their tent and escape from the world. They set up camp in the late afternoon, enjoying the serene atmosphere as the sun began to dip behind the trees. Lena was the one who usually cooked, so she began preparing a simple meal on the portable stove while Jake gathered firewood. They laughed and chatted, enjoying the peacefulness of being the only ones there. It was the kind of silence they had craved, interrupted only by the occasional chirping of birds or rustle of leaves. As night fell, they huddled around the fire, talking about their future, sharing dreams and fears. There were no sounds of nearby campers, just the distant rustling of trees in the wind. The fire crackled, and the stars overhead felt impossibly close. It wasn't until after midnight that things started to feel off. Lena and Jake had just finished their late night snack, preparing to turn in for the night, when they both heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human, walking just outside their tent. The sound was steady, as though someone was pacing around them. Lena's heart began to race, and Jake sat up straight, his eyes wide in the dark. At first, they thought it was an animal, perhaps a bear or a deer, but the footsteps had a rhythm to them, as if someone was walking on 2 feet. It wasn't the usual shuffle of an animal's paws. Jake called out, his voice loud enough to carry through the trees. "Hey, who's out there?" Silence. The footsteps didn't stop. Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine, and she held her breath. "Jake, did you hear that?" He nodded, still staring at the tent flap. "Yeah, I don't know what that is." They waited, listening intently. The footsteps continued to move around the tent, never stopping, but never coming closer either. They couldn't make out any other sounds. No breathing, no movement in the brush. Just those slow, purposeful steps. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the fabric of the tent, but there was nothing there. The beam flickered as he swept it around the perimeter, but the darkness beyond the tent remained still. "Maybe it's just someone else camping nearby," Jake suggested, his voice a little shakier than before. "But if they're not responding, maybe we should just stay quiet and wait it out." Lena nodded, too afraid to argue. She lay back down, clutching the edge of the sleeping bag, listening as the footsteps circled the tent, always at the same distance, never stopping. It felt like hours passed, though it was likely only 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps ceased. Lena and Jake lay awake for what felt like an eternity, but no other sounds came. The night stretched on in tense silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they both fell into a fitful sleep, constantly waking up to check if the footsteps had returned. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they both felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. They crawled out of the tent, eager to start the day and forget the strange experience of the night before. But as they stepped outside, something caught Jake's eye. On the ground around the tent, there were large boot-like footprints. They were deep in the soil, as if someone had been walking heavily, and they circled the tent several times. The prints were fresh, no doubt from the night before. But what was most unsettling was that the footprints didn't lead anywhere. They didn't head toward the woods or a trail. They started at one point, circled the tent, and then just stopped, as though the person had vanished into thin air. "Lena, do you see this?" Jake's voice trembled as he knelt down to inspect the prints. "These tracks, they're huge. And there's no way anyone would have just disappeared like that. Lena's stomach turned. Who would be out here alone in the middle of the night, with no car or gear? There's no one else here. They both stood in uneasy silence for a moment, taking in the eerie emptiness around them. The air felt thick with something unexplainable, a lingering sense that they weren't alone, even though there was no one in sight. After a few moments, they decided to pack up. They were both on edge, and the thought of staying another night in the same spot didn't sit well with either of them. As they hurried to break camp, Lena kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to appear from the trees. But there was only the wind rustling in the branches and the occasional bird call. The drive away from the campsite was quiet. Lena stared out the window, trying to shake the feeling of eyes watching her, while Jake kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. They didn't speak much, but neither of them could shake the unsettling feeling that they weren't alone during those long hours in the tent. To this day, Lena and Jake can't explain what happened that night. They've told the story to friends, but no one seems to have an answer. Some suggest it was a prank, but the size and depth of the footprints didn't fit any normal human or animal. Others think it was a simple case of their nerves getting the best of them, but deep down, they know the truth. They were not alone in those woods. Something had circled their tent, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the world they knew, and it was out there still waiting in the woods. Story 6. The Phantom Fire. It was a cold, crisp evening in the northern wilderness of Alaska. The kind of cold that nips at your bones and fills the air with a quiet stillness. The only sound that broke the silence was the crunch of snow beneath the boots of Dan, a seasoned hiker, and his dog, Kodiak, a large, shaggy wolfhound mix. They had been hiking for days, following the rugged trails and taking in the breathtaking, isolated landscape. The mountains loomed large in the distance, their peaks covered in snow, while the forest stood still, dark and dense. Dan had been to these parts of Alaska before, but this time, he and Kodiak were on their own, in search of solitude. It wasn't unusual to see no one for miles, but that night, something felt different. As they were setting up camp, the wind had begun to pick up, and the sky was overcast, casting the forest in shadows. The two of them were getting their fire going when Dan first noticed the glow in the distance, a faint, flickering light like a campfire. His first thought was that another hiker or camper had set up somewhere nearby, but the light seemed off in some way. It was too steady and bright for a fire that was far away, and it didn't seem to be swaying like the flames in the wind should. Curiosity piqued. Dan stood up from his fire and called Kodiak to his side. "Let's go check it out, boy," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight. The dog, ever loyal, bounded ahead as they made their way toward the light. They walked for about 20 minutes, Kodiak's paws crunching in the snow, and Dan's breath puffing in the cold night air. As they drew closer, the fire grew brighter, its orange and yellow glow becoming more intense, illuminating the trees around it. It looked like a well-established campfire, with flames dancing merrily in the open clearing ahead. But as they rounded a thick cluster of trees to get a better view, something strange happened. The fire, as quickly as it had appeared, suddenly went out. One moment, the clearing was bathed in warm light. The next, It was pitch black, as though the fire had never existed at all. Dan froze, his heart skipping a beat. Kodiak, too, was unsettled, his hackles raised. They both stared at the spot where the fire had been just moments ago, the darkness now swallowing up the area. It was silent, too silent, and the feeling of unease crept up on Dan like a cold shadow. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Kodiak, though the dog could offer no answers. He stood there, staring into the empty clearing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The wind had shifted, and now it was colder, the chill biting deeper into his skin. Dan's instincts told him something was off, something he couldn't explain. He felt an unease that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Without another word, he turned around, signaling Kodiak to follow him back to their campsite. Whatever had happened out here, he wasn't about to stick around to find out. They quickly retraced their steps through the snow-covered forest, trying to push the unsettling experience from their minds. As they neared their camp, Dan felt a strange sense of dread. It was as if the wilderness itself was watching them. The fire back at their camp was still burning brightly, crackling and popping, but when Dan's eyes landed on their tent, a sharp pang of alarm hit him. Something was wrong. The tent was disturbed. It wasn't just the disarray of wind or shifting snow. It was as if someone had been there, rummaging through their things. The zipper was half open, and the flap was hanging loose, flapping in the breeze. The air around them felt colder now, and the fire, despite its warmth, couldn't seem to chase away the icy feeling that had settled in his bones. Dan rushed over to the tent and flung it open. The inside was a mess. Their sleeping bags were pulled out and scattered across the ground. Their backpacks, which had been neatly packed earlier, had been rifled through. But the worst part? Their food was gone, completely missing. The cans of beans and packets of trail mix they had been saving for their meals were nowhere to be found. The bear-proof canisters they had so carefully packed were now wide open, their contents scattered. Dan's stomach turned. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered. His mind raced. Could it have been a bear? No. The food was untouched. Nothing had been clawed open or torn. It seemed deliberate. And the fire that had disappeared so suddenly, it couldn't be a coincidence. Something wasn't right. He grabbed Kodiak's leash and tied the dog to a nearby tree, his hands shaking as he went through the rest of their supplies. Everything seemed to be in place, except the food. It was as though something had intentionally taken it, and Dan couldn't help but wonder if it had been the same thing that had made the fire vanish. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping Dan out of his thoughts. His breath came out in short, frantic puffs as his gaze flicked back to the dark forest that loomed around him. The unsettling sense of being watched grew stronger, and for the first time in his life, he felt an overwhelming urge to leave. No more hiking, no more wilderness, just leave. Dan knew that if he stayed, whatever had taken the food would likely return. He wasn't willing to stick around to find out what kind of creature or person could cause such strange happenings. The unease was suffocating, the feeling that they weren't alone, that something dangerous was lurking just out of sight. He grabbed Kodiak and quickly packed up the remaining supplies. They wouldn't be spending another night here. Without a second thought, Dan and Kodiak began their hurried trek back to the trailhead. The wilderness, once a place of peace, now seemed like an oppressive, hostile force. The phantom fire and the disappearance of their food were just too much to ignore. As they hiked back, the quiet seemed to deepen around them. They reached the trailhead just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a faint, eerie glow on the snowy landscape. Dan's heart was still pounding in his chest, but he was thankful to be leaving. He vowed never to camp in that particular area again. Whatever had happened there, he didn't want to know. But as they walked away, the thought lingered in his mind. The fire, the missing food, the unnerving silence. Had it all been some kind of strange supernatural force? Or was there something or someone else hiding in those dark woods? Dan would never forget the feeling of being watched, and he knew one thing for sure. Some fires aren't meant to be seen, and some dangers are better left undiscovered. Story 7. The Whispers in the Dark. It was the perfect weekend escape, secluded, peaceful, and far away from the noise of city life. The Mitchell family had decided to take a camping trip to the Ozarks, an area known for its natural beauty and serenity. They had rented a small cabin near a quiet campsite nestled deep in the forest, far from any roads or nearby towns. With their 2 children, Emily and Jake, the family settled in for what was meant to be a relaxing getaway. The first night was calm and uneventful. The sound of the fire crackling in the pit, the calls of owls in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze provided the perfect backdrop to their evening. The kids roasted marshmallows, and the parents, Sarah and Greg, enjoyed the peace and quiet. After a few hours, they all retired to the cabin to get some sleep. Around midnight, Sarah was the first to wake up. The sound of whispers filled the cabin. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling through the trees or the distant sound of animals. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, and closer, so close, in fact, that she could almost hear words. They were soft at first, like a faint murmur that could easily be brushed aside. But as she lay in bed, she realized the voices were repeating something, calling out, "Sarah." She froze. The voice was unmistakably calling her name, low and unnerving. Sarah turned her head toward Greg, lying beside her, but he was still fast asleep. She dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a result of being in the forest surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. But then, just as she began to drift off again, she heard it once more. "Sarah." This time, it was clearer. The voice sounded almost desperate. She lay still, her heart beating faster as she strained to listen. She waited for the wind to pick up again, to offer some explanation, but instead, the whispers continued, and something about them felt wrong, like they were coming from all around her, as though the woods themselves were speaking. She waited for the voices to stop. After what felt like an eternity, they did. Sarah quickly dismissed it as her imagination running wild. But when she closed her eyes again, she could still hear the faint rustling of leaves outside the cabin. The next morning, she decided not to mention it to Greg. He would just brush it off as her overactive imagination. But as they sat down to breakfast, Emily, their 10-year-old daughter, spoke up. "Mom, I heard someone calling my name last night," she said quietly, looking down at her cereal bowl. Sarah froze. "What do you mean?" "I heard someone say, Emily." Emily. Over and over, Emily continued, looking confused but calm. It was so weird. It felt like it was coming from the trees. Greg, who had been flipping through a map of nearby trails, paused and glanced at Sarah. Are you sure it wasn't just the wind or something? Emily shook her head. No, it sounded like someone was standing right outside the window. Sarah looked at Greg, both of them uneasy now. They didn't want to scare the kids. But something about the way Emily had described the voices sent a chill through Sarah. It was too similar to what she had heard. Later that afternoon, after a short hike around the area, they returned to their campsite. As they sat around the fire, Greg tried to make light of the situation, but there was an underlying tension in the air. The whispers from the night before seemed to hang over them, and the eerie feeling of being watched lingered. But as nightfall approached, Sarah noticed something strange. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily still. Yet, as the darkness deepened, the air became thick with an unsettling quiet. The crickets and night creatures were unusually silent. It was then that the whispers began again, this time louder than before, and again they were calling their names. But this time, they weren't just coming from the trees. Greg, Emily, Sarah, Jake. The voices echoed from different directions, as though they were coming from all around them. It was as if the entire forest was alive and speaking, each whisper a different voice, but all calling their names. The family froze, unable to pinpoint where the voices were coming from. They sounded too human to be the wind, and too precise to be animals. Greg stood up, his face pale. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice shaky. Sarah nodded, her throat dry. Jake, their son, clutched his father's hand tightly. The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another. Mom, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. What is that? Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her children's hands, pulling them toward the cabin. They hurried inside, closing the door behind them with trembling hands. The whispers didn't stop. They continued, louder now, as if the forest itself had surrounded them. As the family huddled together in the cabin, Sarah tried to calm her children. Greg went to the door and peered outside, but there was nothing. No movement in the woods, no signs of any animals or people. The air was thick with the sound of their own rapid breathing, and yet the whispers persisted, coming from the trees surrounding the cabin. It felt as though something or someone was waiting for them to step outside. As the hours dragged on, the whispers seemed to grow more insistent, calling their names over and over again. In the early hours of the morning, Sarah could take it no longer. Her fear had reached its breaking point. We need to leave, she whispered urgently to Greg. We're not safe here. They quickly packed up their belongings, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But the whispers only seemed to grow louder, angrier, as if the woods were rejecting their departure. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the Mitchell family was on the road, leaving behind their campsite and the strange, terrifying whispers that had haunted them. Weeks later, after returning home, Sarah decided to do some research. She found an old online forum where others had reported similar experiences in the area. Campers, hikers, and locals alike had experienced strange whispers and voices calling their names in the woods around the Ozarks. Some believed it was the spirits of long-dead settlers, while others thought it might be something far darker, a force that had lived in the forest long before humans settled in the area. But the Mitchell family never went back. The voices calling their names stayed with them, a constant reminder that sometimes the wilderness holds more than just trees and wildlife. It holds secrets that can never be explained. Story 8. The Black Figures in the Trees. It was meant to be a weekend escape, an opportunity for 4 close friends, Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah, to unplug and enjoy the serene beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains. They had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape their busy lives and embrace the quiet, vast wilderness. The hike to their chosen campsite was long, but manageable, and as the sun began to set behind the mountains, they set up their tents, laughing and joking as they unpacked their gear. The night fell quickly, the darkness swallowing up the woods around them. They gathered around the campfire, the warmth of the flames contrasting against the cool mountain air. It was peaceful at first, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of owls breaking the silence. As they sat around the fire, Emily noticed something strange. She leaned closer to the fire, trying to get a better look, and saw a dark shape move quickly between the trees. It was only a brief glimpse, but it was enough to make her pause. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the shadows, maybe a large animal moving through the forest. She didn't say anything at first, but when she glanced at the others, she saw that they, too, had noticed. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Jake exchanged uneasy glances before nodding. "Yeah," Mark said, his voice a little shaky. "There's something out there." The group fell silent, their attention now focused on the dark expanse of trees around them. The forest felt different now, almost oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds more distant. A strange tension had settled over them. "I'll go check it out," Jake offered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "Stay here. It's probably just a deer or something." Mark frowned. "I don't know if that's a good idea, man." Jake shrugged. "We'll be fine. I'm just going to take a quick look around." He ventured into the trees, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dark. The others sat anxiously around the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over them. They could hear Jake's footsteps crunching through the underbrush, but the sound soon disappeared into the dense woods. Minutes passed, and the silence grew heavier. Mark was about to call out to Jake when they all heard something. Soft footfalls, light but deliberate, moving through the forest just beyond their camp. It wasn't the usual animal sounds they had grown accustomed to hearing. No rustling leaves or scampering creatures. These were steps, too purposeful and too human. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Jake?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Instead, the footsteps grew louder, closer. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift, and once again, they saw the shadowy figures moving through the woods, always at the edge of the campfire's light. They were tall and lanky, too tall to be ordinary animals, and their movements were unnervingly smooth and silent. "I see them again," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide in terror. Mark stood up and grabbed the flashlight, shining it into the trees. For a brief moment, The light illuminated a figure standing just outside the firelight, partially hidden behind a thick trunk. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was distorted, its features blurred by the darkness. Before anyone could say anything, it vanished into the shadows. Jake finally returned, looking shaken. He had no idea what was happening, but he could tell something was wrong. He could feel it, the strange energy in the air, the pressure that seemed to weigh down on them all. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been seeing figures out there," Emily said, her voice shaking. "In the trees. They're moving around us. They're watching us," Sarah added, her eyes darting around nervously. Jake's eyes widened, and he scanned the area with his flashlight, but he saw nothing. The forest around them was still and quiet, almost too quiet. The wind had stopped, and even the crickets seemed to have gone silent. "We need to leave," Mark said urgently, his voice tight with fear. "Now." The group gathered their things quickly, each of them feeling as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. They packed up in a frantic rush, their movements clumsy as they tried to leave as quickly as possible. No one spoke as they worked, each person lost in their own thoughts, each sensing the same unspoken terror that lingered in the air. As they made their way back down the trail, away from the campsite, they looked over their shoulders, half expecting to see the figures following them. But there was nothing. The woods were as still as ever, as if the strange presence had vanished with the light of day. When they finally reached the parking lot at the base of the mountain, they felt a wave of relief wash over them. They were safe, at least for now. But none of them would forget the terror they'd felt that night. The strange figures moving silently through the trees, watching them from the shadows. They never spoke of it again, but in the years that followed, each of them would find themselves returning to that memory, always wondering what had been lurking in the woods that night, just beyond their sight, and whether it was truly gone or still out there waiting. Story 9. The Unseen Stalker. It was late September when Jason decided to take a solo camping trip in Wyoming's vast national park. He had been dreaming of getting away from the chaos of his busy life, looking for some peace in nature, a chance to clear his mind. The park, with its sweeping mountains and dense forests, seemed like the perfect place to escape. He had spent the day hiking, taking in the breathtaking views, and setting up camp in a secluded spot far from the nearest trail or other campers. As dusk began to fall, Jason built a small fire, settling near it with a thermos of hot tea. He felt the weight of the day's hike in his bones, but the stillness of the wilderness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, was soothing. The stars began to emerge, sparkling high above, and the night grew colder, so he retreated into his tent to rest. The sounds of the forest at night were nothing new to him, an owl hooting in the distance, the occasional bark of a coyote, but soon he began to hear something that made him freeze. At first, it was just a faint rustling sound, barely noticeable over the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something deliberate. Footsteps. Jason's heart began to race. He instinctively thought of the wildlife that roamed the park, bears, cougars, or elk. But something about the pattern of the footsteps made him uneasy. The sound wasn't random. It was calculated, measured. The footsteps were too steady, too purposeful, and they seemed to be circling his campsite. He lay perfectly still, straining his ears to make sense of it. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing around the perimeter of his tent. They came closer, moving to the side, and then back again, just outside the thin walls of the tent. His throat tightened. Bears were unpredictable, sure, but they usually didn't stalk a campsite like this. And the way the steps moved, they didn't sound like animal tracks. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized the footsteps had now drawn incredibly close, right to the edge of his tent. He could hear them shifting around in the dirt, pausing, then continuing again, almost as if whatever or whoever was out there was waiting for something, watching him. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Jason quietly unzipped the tent just enough to poke his head out. His pulse was pounding in his ears. He scanned the darkness, the beam of light sweeping across the campsite. His heart skipped a beat as his light bounced off the trees and rocks, but there was no sign of any animal. No shadow moving in the trees, no rustling underbrush. The footsteps had stopped, as if they had never been there. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He waited for a long time, not daring to move, his flashlight flickering in his hand. Every little noise, every crack of a twig in the distance, made his skin crawl. But there was nothing. He had no choice but to lie there, his mind racing, wondering if it had all been his imagination. But deep down, Jason knew he wasn't alone. When dawn broke, Jason hesitated to leave the safety of his tent. The morning light felt comforting after the terror of the night, but his curiosity and anxiety drove him out into the open. He inspected the campsite with caution, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when he saw them. Footprints, large ones around the tent and along the edge of the campsite. At first, Jason assumed they were animal tracks, but as he knelt down for a closer look, he realized the truth. These weren't animal prints at all. The tracks were clearly human. A pair of heavy, deliberate steps marked the ground, each print deep in the dirt. They were barefoot, the edges of the prints jagged and rough, as if the person had been walking in a hurry. The tracks were not only strange for being human, they were also leading away from his tent into the woods. But there was something else unsettling. The prints led in a straight line, but they seemed to stop suddenly, as if the person had vanished into the trees. There were no further marks, no signs of any movement beyond that point. It was as though whoever, or whatever, had made the tracks had simply disappeared. Jason's mind raced. The logical explanation that someone had wandered into his camp in the middle of the night seemed impossible. No one else had been anywhere near the park for miles, and he was certain he hadn't heard any cars, voices, or other hikers during his trip. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching him, staying just out of his sight, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. With his heart still pounding, Jason packed up his gear faster than he'd ever done before. He didn't want to stick around to investigate further. As he hiked back toward the trailhead, his mind kept replaying the strange events of the night. Had it been a prank, a wander in the woods, or something far more sinister? No matter what the explanation was, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the wilderness than met the eye, that the forest, in its isolation and quiet, had its own dark secrets. He never camped alone again. Story 10. The Animal That Wasn't. The dense forests of Washington state are a prime destination for those seeking solitude, an escape from the noise of civilization. For Ryan, a solo camper who loved the peace of the wilderness, the remote trails and secluded campsites were the perfect way to recharge. He'd spent countless nights in the woods, often alone, but something about this trip felt different from the start. Ryan had chosen a quiet clearing far from the main hiking trail, tucked away deep in the Olympic National Forest. The sun had already set, and the trees cast long, stretching shadows over his campsite. After setting up his tent, he stoked a fire and settled in, enjoying the calming crackles of the wood. The evening was peaceful, the only sounds being the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. As the night deepened, Ryan began to feel the familiar weight of isolation. There was a strange quiet in the air, the kind that comes when even the animals are still. He shrugged off the uneasy feeling, reminding himself that he was alone, in control, and that the woods were his sanctuary. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural growl. At first, it was faint, almost like an echo of a distant thunderstorm, but it grew louder, reverberating through the stillness of the night. Ryan froze, his body instinctively tense. His mind raced through a list of possibilities. A bear? Maybe a cougar? He had read plenty about the animals in the area, and both were known to roam the dense woods of the Olympic Peninsula. He reminded himself to stay calm. His food was securely hung high in the trees, out of reach from the bears. The growling persisted, each reverberation rattling his nerves. It wasn't the sort of sound made by any animal he knew of. It wasn't just a growl. It was almost like a warning, a threat that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The growl came again, closer this time, unmistakably circling his tent. He could hear something moving in the underbrush, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath heavy paws. But the sound didn't match the heavy step of a bear. It was lighter, faster, as though whatever was outside was moving with purpose. Ryan's mind raced as he slowly reached for his flashlight. He'd been camping in these woods before, but never had he felt such a primal, gut-wrenching fear. His heartbeat seemed louder than the growls, pounding in his ears as he slowly, cautiously, zipped open the corner of his tent. He waited, trying to steady his breath. The growling came again, but this time it was right outside the tent. Ryan could feel the ground vibrating beneath him with each movement. The air had grown thick, oppressive, as if the very forest had grown heavy with something unseen. He gripped the flashlight tightly, his knuckles white, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it on. Something, instinct, maybe, told him not to reveal himself. The growls came again, this time closer still. But when Ryan finally dared to peek outside, he saw no animal. Instead, there were two glowing eyes staring back at him from the edge of the trees. They weren't the eyes of a bear or a cougar. Those eyes would be lower to the ground. These eyes were much higher, almost level with the height of his tent, and they glowed an unnatural shade of amber, like the reflection of car headlights in the dark. The eyes didn't blink, they didn't move. They just stared, unblinking and unrelenting, as though watching him with a deliberate intensity. Ryan's heart slammed against his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as his eyes locked onto those two glowing orbs. Every logical part of his mind screamed for him to get up, to act, to do something, but his body remained frozen. The growl came again, but now it was closer, right next to the tent, just beyond the thin fabric that separated Ryan from whatever was outside. The air felt cold, colder than it should have been for an August night. The growl was almost a whisper now, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the woods. Ryan's thoughts were racing, but all he could focus on was the pair of eyes. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached for the zipper of his tent, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't hear him. His body moved with deliberate slowness, as if trying to remain undetected. Finally, he managed to zip the tent closed, sealing himself inside. He pulled his sleeping bag tightly around him, trying to block out the sounds that still echoed around the tent. The growls, the soft footfalls, and that lingering feeling of being watched. Minutes turned into hours, and still, the growling didn't stop. The eyes never left. In his mind, Ryan was trapped, knowing that the forest outside wasn't the same anymore. He wasn't alone, but whatever was out there wasn't an animal, not in any way he could understand. Eventually, the growling ceased, the footsteps faded, and the eerie presence in the forest seemed to slip away, as if it had never been there. But Ryan knew better. He had felt it, the weight of something ancient, something otherworldly. By the time dawn broke, Ryan was already packed up, his gear hastily thrown into his backpack. He didn't look back as he walked down the trail, but every so often, he would feel a strange tug at his senses, as if those glowing eyes were still watching him, just beyond the tree line. He never figured out what had been stalking him that night. He never saw it clearly, and to this day, he can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't an animal. It was something darker, something that belonged to the woods, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. Ryan would never camp alone again in those forests. Some things, he realized, were meant to remain unexplained.